It was a cold, overcast day when a single rider turned up to the gates of a notorious biker club. He wasn't just any biker, he was a black man, tall, with a hard-earned confidence that came with years of facing prejudice, rejection, and an unshakable will to carve his own place in the world. This wasn't just another club he was riding into, it was a place where for years, the color of your skin defined whether you belonged or not. It was a place where black riders had been pushed away, ignored, and told they weren't welcome. But today, things were about to change. Imagine the scene, an iron gate with the emblem of the club staring you down like a challenge. Behind it, the roar of motorcycles reverberated in the air, a sound that commanded respect. A sound that belonged to men who had lived through battles, both on the road and in life. And then there he was, pulling up to those very gates. A black man. Alone, his bike, polished and gleaming, was his only company. He didn't carry any signs of fear, though many would have. This wasn't just about the club. It was about an entire culture that had rejected him, and today, he was here to demand his place. The riders inside the club had always believed that certain rules were set in stone. One of those rules was clear. There was no place for black riders in their ranks. Some of them came from backgrounds where racism was ingrained in their lives. Some just followed the crowd, not questioning traditions they grew up with. But there was one man who would change all of that, and that man was none other than the rider who was now standing before the gates. As the black rider slowly revved his engine, a couple of the club's most notorious members stepped forward. They were known for their hardened personalities, their years of maintaining the status quo, and their reluctance to change. The air was thick with tension, each man sizing up the other. The questions were already forming in their minds. Who did this guy think he was? Did he really think he could just waltz in here and change things? Did he have the guts to face what they had built? What they didn't know was that this wasn't just a story of one man trying to prove his worth. This was a story of challenge, change, and the power of human connection. It was a day that would go down in history, not because of one bold rider's actions, but because of how he made others question their own beliefs, their own prejudices, and their own place in a world that was changing whether they liked it or not. But even before he could say a word, the tension was palpable. The riders inside the club weren't used to seeing a black man roll in, let alone one who seemed so confident. They'd heard rumors of outsiders trying to push for change, but this felt different. The biker world was a world where words weren't often needed. Actions spoke volumes. The black rider knew that, and he was ready for whatever was about to come. He didn't just ride in to be a guest. He rode in to take a stand. One of the club's senior members, a man known as Big D, stepped forward. His broad shoulders and gruff voice commanded attention, and it was said he had never backed down from a challenge in his life. He was the one who had built the club's reputation, the one who had made sure it stood for certain ideals that had kept people like the black rider at bay. Big D wasn't the type to shy away from confrontation, but as he stared at the black rider in front of him, something was different. For the first time in his life, a feeling of uncertainty crept in. He wasn't sure what this man was about, but he could see the fire in his eyes. He could see the man wasn't here to fight. He was here for something bigger than that. And that was the moment when Big D's grip on his beliefs began to loosen. The others were watching, waiting to see how the confrontation would unfold. There was something unnerving about how calm the black rider seemed, something unsettling about the way he sat tall in the saddle, his eyes unwavering. The entire club was on edge. This wasn't going to be like any other day, but just as Big D opened his mouth to speak, another rider, a younger man who had only recently joined the club, stepped forward. His face was more open than the others, his mind less encumbered by years of prejudice. He looked at the black rider, then at Big D, and in that instant, something shifted. "I don't think this is about what we're used to," he said, his voice low but firm. "I think it's about what we can become." Those words, simple and powerful, hung in the air. The younger rider's question wasn't just about the black man in front of them. It was about the future of the club, the future of their community, and the future of what it meant to be a rider. The tension wasn't gone yet, but for the first time that day, it felt like it could be. The black rider, standing tall as ever, met the gaze of everyone around him. No one knew it yet, but his arrival would mark the beginning of something far greater than any of them could have anticipated. It wasn't just a fight for respect. It was a fight for unity, for humanity, for the idea that people of all colors, backgrounds, and experiences had something valuable to offer. And just as the day was about to take a turn, as the silence in the air thickened, the question that loomed over everyone was clear. Would this moment spark the change everyone was so afraid of? Or would the club close its doors to something they were too scared to understand? The moment the young writer spoke, it was as if a crack had appeared in the armor the club had built around itself for years. The older members exchanged glances, their faces hardened by years of loyalty to the way things had always been. But something about that simple statement, "I think it's about what we can become," struck a chord with more than just the Black Rider. It made the air feel heavier, the tension rising to a point where it seemed like something had to give. Big D stared at the younger rider for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The old man's knuckles whitened around the handlebars of his bike, his gaze still locked on the Black Rider. He didn't trust what was happening, not one bit. The world he had built, the world where loyalty, toughness, and tradition ruled, was beginning to unravel before his eyes. He had always been the one to set the rules, the one to dictate who was worthy and who wasn't. And now, there was a stranger, a man of a different color, standing in front of him, challenging everything he stood for. But as the seconds ticked by, something unexpected happened. Big D's grip loosened. It wasn't that he agreed with the Black Rider or the younger man, not yet. But something in the pit of his stomach told him that if he didn't listen, if he didn't at least try to understand what was going on, he would lose something far more important than a simple rule. He would lose the chance to lead this club into something bigger, something better. The Black Rider, who had remained silent up to this point, finally spoke. His voice was steady, not angry, not pleading, but full of quiet conviction. "I didn't come here to fight," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "I didn't come here to take over your world. I came here because there's something I believe in, something bigger than any of us. It's about respect. It's about giving everyone a chance, no matter where they come from or what they look like." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating almost. But the club members, especially the older ones, were not used to hearing this kind of talk. The biker world had always been about strength, about proving yourself through action, not words. They didn't know how to handle this challenge, and that uncertainty made them uneasy. A few of the riders, the ones who had been in the club for years, muttered under their breath. They were all too familiar with the unspoken rule that had been passed down through generations. You don't let anyone in who doesn't fit the mold. The Black Rider didn't fit that mold. He wasn't the rough, hardened man that most of them were used to seeing. He didn't have the same history, the same scars. He was an outsider, and in their world, outsiders weren't welcome. But as Big D looked around, he realized something. The room wasn't filled with just the old guard anymore. There were newer faces, younger men who had joined in the last few years. Riders who had seen the world outside the walls of the club, who had learned that things were changing, that the rules of the past weren't always the right ones. These younger men weren't as attached to tradition as the older members were. They weren't as quick to close their minds, and they were more open to the idea of what the Black Rider represented. Big D's eyes flicked over to Jake. The young man wasn't saying anything that Big D hadn't heard before. He had heard similar sentiments from others, but Jake's words were different. They were simple, grounded, and carried a truth that Big D couldn't ignore. For the first time that day, Big D looked at the Black Rider, not as an outsider, not as someone who didn't belong, but as a man who had earned his place, whether the club liked it or not. And with that realization, Big D felt something he hadn't expected. A sense of uncertainty. The weight of history was heavy on his shoulders, but in that moment, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be as easy as he had imagined. It would require something more than just brute strength and loyalty. It would require growth, understanding, and the willingness to let go of old prejudices. But before Big D could respond, the sound of revving engines broke through the tension. A few of the other riders, some of the more outspoken members of the old guard, had started their bikes, clearly agitated. The noise was deafening, and it only added to the building storm inside the club. Big D's mind raced. He had to make a decision. He had to decide whether to hold on to the past or face the uncertain future that the Black Rider and the younger members were urging him toward. As the tension mounted and the engines roared louder, it was clear. The moment of truth was fast approaching. Would Big D stand his ground and risk losing the future of the club, or would he embrace the change, even if it meant breaking everything he had known? The silence that followed was the calm before the storm. The roar of the motorcycles seemed to grow louder, reverberating through the air as Big D's eyes scanned the room. His hands gripped the handlebars of his bike tighter, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The tension was unbearable. On one side, the old guard, the ones who had lived and breathed by the club's rules for years. On the other, the younger riders, the ones who had seen the world beyond the narrow boundaries of tradition. And in the middle of it all, the black rider, standing firm, waiting for his chance, for his moment. For a long minute, Big D did nothing but stare at the rider. The eyes of the room were on him, and the weight of their expectations felt suffocating. The older members had made it clear where they stood. They wanted the status quo. The young ones, however, had found something in the black rider's courage, something they could relate to. They wanted change, a future where their bonds weren't defined by race or history but by the strength of their hearts. Big D could feel the pull in both directions. The loyalty to the old ways that had shaped his life. The bonds he had built over the years with his brothers in arms. And yet, as he looked at the faces of the younger men, he couldn't help but wonder if they weren't right. What had all those years of division really gotten them? Was this the future the club deserved? Could they stay relevant in a world that was evolving, or would they be left behind? As the noise from the engines reached a crescendo, Big D's mind snapped into focus. He thought of the many rides, the countless hours spent on the road, the battles fought side by side with men who had become his brothers. But none of that felt as important as what was happening right now. The club had stood for so long, but now it was being tested, not by an external threat, but by its own beliefs. He looked back at the black rider, who stood there unwavering, silent but strong. It was no longer about skin color, about past injustices. It was about something bigger. Big D knew it. The others knew it. The question wasn't whether the black rider belonged. It was whether the club could evolve and rise to meet the moment. Could they truly call themselves brothers if they turned away from this opportunity? Without another word, Big D stood up from his bike. He took a deep breath, the cold air cutting through him like a jolt. "All right," he said, his voice rough but resolute. "You want to prove you belong here? Then prove it. We ride together. We'll see if you're willing to back up your words with actions. And if you do, maybe we'll see what this club can really become." The room was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, a few of the older members, the ones who had been reluctant, started to nod. It wasn't a unanimous decision, but it was enough. The shift was happening, and it couldn't be stopped. They didn't know what the future would look like, but they had taken the first step into the unknown, into something better. The black rider's face softened, his posture still strong but now tinged with a sense of relief. He didn't take his eyes off Big D. There was a new understanding between them. It wasn't a victory, at least not yet, but it was a start. He nodded back, silently agreeing to the challenge, ready to show that he wasn't just a symbol of change, he was part of it. As the engines rumbled to life, the atmosphere shifted. The riders, once divided, now seemed to stand together. It wasn't perfect. Not by any means, but it was progress. The black rider climbed onto his bike and revved the engine, the sound blending with the others as they all pulled out of the lot together. For the first time, it didn't matter who was leading or who was following. They were all just riders, bound by the road and the freedom it offered. As they rode down the highway, the wind whipping past them, the sense of unity was palpable. There was no fanfare, no grand declaration. The change had happened quietly, but powerfully. It was a shift that didn't need to be announced to the world. The world would see it in the way they rode, in the way they treated each other, in the way they lived from now on. And as the miles stretched out before them, the black rider, once an outsider, knew he had earned his place. He had fought for it, not with fists or anger, but with the simple power of being himself, unapologetically. The club had been forced to face its own demons, to confront its biases, and to decide if it was truly about brotherhood or about exclusion. The sun began to dip low in the sky as they rode together, the silhouettes of their bikes stretching long in the fading light. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, it felt like the journey wasn't about escaping the past. It was about embracing the future. And as the black rider glanced over at Big D, who rode beside him, he realized something even more profound. The battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. The road ahead would be filled with more challenges, more friction, and more moments of doubt. But the one thing he knew for certain now was that change was inevitable, and in the end, it would be the riders who embraced it, no matter their color or background, who would find themselves riding toward a new kind of freedom. The sun set on that day, but it marked the beginning of something greater. something that had the power to reshape not just a club, but an entire community. And as they rode into the horizon, the future was no longer uncertain. It was open, wide, and full of possibility.